Life is a journey.
There's times in this journey when we really have to stop and recalculate.
So when you think about your history in your marriage, there are really amazing, joyful times, and there are some really painful, hard times.
And it's easy for us to wear at different paces.
Do you have this ability to be vulnerable so that you can be sensitive to one another? The minute you start drifting into
Comparison,
yes,
I think.
that leads to a very chilly ride.
So I think these comparisons can actually be judgments.
It takes 5 positive things to erase that one negative thing.
Be careful, because we can also compare other couples.
And when things are working and humming, it's because you're collaborating. You're not competing with each other.
But it is about staying grounded and connected.
How do I lift you up? How do I encourage you? What do you need my help with to make your life thrive and then our life together thrive?
And depending on our journey together, what do we need to do to go forward?
Welcome to The Inspired Marriage. I am Diane Hollenbeck.
And I'm Kevin Hallenbeck.
And we want to work with successful couples who want to deepen their marriage. So today we really want to talk about what we've coined as the marriage dashboard. So when you're taking a journey together, there's a dashboard in your car, or if you're on a plane, there's a dashboard. Life is a journey. And you get to decide how much attention you pay to the instruments that are in that vehicle. So today we want to unpack that idea that marriage has a dashboard and you can maintain it in really positive and helpful ways.
It's useful to just stop sometimes before you go do anything and make sure on a journey that the gas tank is full before you head out. As simple as that, right? So it's that sort of thought that we have of how do we kind of evaluate where we are in the moment, and that's what we're going to do today.
So the first thing you're going to check is, how far are you going, right? So we've taken some long trips with our kids. One time we went all the way down to Williamsburg, Virginia with 5 kids in the car on I-95. And of course there was a huge accident, and, the medical helicopters there and all that. We all got out of the car, and it was really a clear time to say how far have we gone and how far do we have to go. Right? And so for us, the idea of looking at that instrument, it's really about our history together. Like, how far have we traveled together, Kevin and I? Obviously, you've heard us before on the podcast, 36 and a half years. That's a long journey, right? Kevin's parents have been married 69 years. That's a very long journey, right? Hoping to make it that far. But what is the journey looking like as you go that far?
Yeah, and it's as we've traveled this journey together, one of us is driving, one of us looking out the window or looking in the back seat or whatever, right? So we experience this journey differently, even though we've done it together. And I think it's interesting to think about as we check in on this dashboard, like, what's your perspective of the mileage, the odometer, the journey, right, versus mine? But time is certainly one measure. And the longer we've been together, the more shared experiences we have. It's as simple as that. I mean, if I met you last week and we were sitting here, we could have quite a nice conversation, but we wouldn't have this history that we have to draw on and these experiences. And we may remember it differently, and we do sometimes, and see it differently, but still we were there together. And I think that in and of itself, we have a shared history. And then, of course, we also have a history before we were together that collectively makes up our life to this point.
Yeah, and history is an interesting thing because it's another way to say story, right? So when you think about your history in your marriage, there are really amazing, joyful times, and there are some really painful, hard times. And the trick and the beauty about life is every day is a new gift. So you get to decide, am I going to hang on to? You obviously have to work through your story, right? You have to be honest and say, and that's something that we want to be really careful about. We want to be honest about our story. Like, so for instance, for us, we have some shared history, and like, as Kevin said, we have some not shared history, right? Where Kevin grew up in a very kind of Leave It to Beaver family. His mom's name is June. I mean, it's hilarious, really, right? Where for me, I grew up in rural poverty in upstate New York with a very, very different history. So I bring all of this baggage into the car that we're driving in or whatever way we're traveling in, right? My baggage is extra full. Kevin travels pretty light emotionally, really, right? This is a huge thing because I'm often unpacking and repacking things that he has no idea about, right? So the point I want to make about this journey, the way your history goes, is that you need to look at that and say, well, how much of this can I let go? And I've learned that over the last 4 or 5 years as our kids are grown. And I grew up with 4 brothers and a sister, and we have 4 sons and a daughter. And it's been a beautiful mirror image of what life can be like when you grow up and you raise a family in a loving environment, right? So we've done that. But every once in a while, some wild memory will kick up for me. And I remember one time Kevin was smoking a cigar and I lost my mind. It's happened a couple times in our marriage, but I lost my mind, because it triggered a really bad memory and he had no idea the cigars were not allowed, never, ever, ever. But I had to tell him that part of my story that I hadn't shared before, right? So now all of a sudden here's new shared story, new shared history, and then there's this ability to journey together in a sensitive way. So this is the important part about the journey. The journey that you're taking together is, do you have this ability to share story, to be vulnerable so that you can be sensitive to one another? Not that Kevin can never have a cigar. That's not the point. I'm not controlling him with my pain or history, but I'm just saying, hey, this is what I need. I need space. Have your cigar outside. Whatever agreements you come to as you travel together, there has to be vulnerability and an ability to be sensitive to one another.
Yeah, and I do think that along the way there are milestones. There are moments that are special markers, if you will. I mean, there's our marriage, right? The day we got married, November 7th, 1987. I remember. That's good. But that's a particular marker, and that will always be a special day. The day that we first met, March 7th that same year. The day we had our first child in 1990. The day we had our second, all these different things. And so I think that some of those milestones are dramatic changes in your life experience, like marriage. Like we were separate, now we're together. That's a very big change. The first child is a very big change. The fourth, the fifth, I mean, we love you guys, but the reality is we're already parents, and it's a change. So I want to suggest there's times in this journey together when we really have to stop and recalculate and reset, right? So the part of what we want to think about in the dashboard is, are you near a point where you need a oil change or a transmission change or whatever? Are there, as you look at this in your journey, where are you? Did you just come out of the shop, everything's great, and you're good for the next 10,000 miles or not? And the same would be true of anything. So it is interesting to think about where we've been, what we've done, and depending on our journey together, what do we need to do to go forward? So it's both a looking back, but it also is preparing to move forward.
Yeah, and one last thing on story and journey. I think one other really critical season and shift and change and marker is when, if you have a family, the last one leaves for college. There's the last, it's called the empty nest. I don't really actually believe that, because all the birds fly home and, it gets really big and busy when they're all, home again. But the point is that for Kevin, that was not a big shift, right? For me, it was like a seismic shift, right? It was a whole identity shift of raising a family, that being my major emphasis to nothing in my hands kind of thing. So even that piece of it, be careful in that way, like where you are in the markers and how you perceive the markers. It's going to be different, right? So that's another thing to be careful. So let's move on to another dashboard, maybe the oil change, like looking at that idea of how do you keep things going smoothly in the car? Like really it's about communication, right? So for us, the dashboard of communication, I think, has been one of the hardest maybe, is we see things differently. We have different personalities. I'm a deep thinker who wades in the waters all the time. Kevin's like, hey, where's the fun?
And again, some of this is getting to know each other. But as I've said in the past, you're not the same. I mean, like, I think I know you, and then you constantly surprise me. And that can be very frustrating, but it's very beautiful too, right? Like, oh, it's never boring. We have to constantly check in, even right there. Like, what's going on? I need to read you. What are you thinking? What am I thinking? Because I think there's what we express or what we say. And frankly, the English language is imperfect. And when we say something, it's not just what we say, it's how we say it. It's, are we looking? Are we smiling? It's micro expressions. I mean, there's so much science to communication. But as a couple, we just have to do it every day, right? And that can be, after we finish dinner together and we're putting away the dishes. It could be first thing in the morning. It could be, how's your day? I mean, there's all these moments, and we don't want to overanalyze it, but we do want to say, how are we doing in general at communicating right now? Do I feel heard? Do you feel heard? So there is this kind of check-in, like, how's that going right now? Is that fair?
Yeah, that's very fair. And I think part of it is what way you process words. So I'm a verbal processor, and Kevin is an internal processor. So I get very few words that have already all been sliced and diced, where I'm always slicing and dicing out loud. And so I say a lot of things a lot of the time. It's really true. And Kevin's is very much keep it close, and then out comes the thing. Or if you're verbally processing, it's not on an emotional level. It's more like the things of the day. So it's very interesting, but also how we use words. Like, I think this is the important part about, maybe this is kind of the grade of oil that you use, but words that are used to encourage and strengthen and build up, and almost, I'm going to use the word bless, like really lift up the other person. Or is it just, what are you doing? What did you do today? I'll comment on this, criticize that. Oh, the plants need to be watered. Why didn't you do that? It takes 5 positive things to erase that one negative thing you say. So be really careful about how often are you criticizing your partner, right?
Yeah, yeah. And what I've learned is that I'm not intending to criticize. I'm just saying the plants need to be watered. The point is that I don't even intend it as criticism, but you hear it as criticism. And I think it's important. There's intention, but there's also how we received it. And the other side is, maybe you've just had a tough day and you're more sensitive, or maybe you've had a great day and it doesn't bother you. Everything's dynamic, right? In this marriage partnership that we have. And so we have to check in all the time, because literally, if I said the exact same thing yesterday versus today, it will be received differently to some degree, potentially. I don't know. It's part of the beauty of it, but it's also part of the frustration. So it's not like we take this dashboard, okay, we're good with communication, we're good for the next 10,000 miles. No, we're probably good for the next 10 minutes. And then it can all go off the rails in a hurry.
Yeah, and I think one great question is asking your partner, what did you hear me say? Because when you do that, you clarify it. There's no criticism there. There's all the clarity, this mutual mystification that people have. Like, it's all clear. Well, what I heard you say is this. And then the person can say, oh, no, this is what I meant, right? And so that allows for the give and the take, because communication isn't just me talking at Kevin, which I'm so good at. Communication is what he hears, and then did he hear what I said, right? There's all these ways of communicating, even body language. Like, be careful that when you're upset, you know what your face is saying, right? That's something that we kind of laugh about, because Kevin doesn't always know what his face is saying. I don't always know what my face is saying, but that can be really challenging for sure.
I think, to go back, I process internally. I also process externally, so it's a little of both. But a lot of times I've thought through something, and then I don't say as many words about something. And so the danger for me communicating in that context is I've thought this through, and I'm already kind of have processed, right? So I'm kind of, it sounds like I'm dictating, like, this is what we should do, right? Because where Diane, you will process more externally without having decided. And I'm like, well, and what happens is then you tell me things amidst this external processing. And it's just, whether it's internal or external processing, I hear, but I don't hear the key things. And then later on, well, I told you that. And I'm like, okay, but I didn't pick it up, right? Because where I'm I tend to be fewer words. I can be longer winded on a podcast, right? But it's just interesting. And just to say that it's different and we have to respect each other. So to your point, this is what I heard you say, or this is what I think I understood, becomes so important because you can't know what's in my head. And I don't necessarily know when you're just processing versus when you've kind of decided. Sometimes it's not clear to me, right? So I need to say, in what you just said, is this what you meant? And so it's that we have to check in, and if we're regularly checking in on what one or the other meant, we're better off.
For sure, for sure. And I think with communication, there's a couple of things to just be really aware of. You can't let things like criticism and hurtful words stick, right? You have to clear the air. And I think clearing the air in communication is really hard because it involves words like, I'm sorry. I didn't mean that. Like there's a little bit of, I'm going to use the word humility here, where you have to be able to say, not always defending your position, but just saying, that's not what I meant. I'm so sorry. Like it makes a big difference. You go a lot further and a lot happier if you can actually be kind with your words. So be careful about that. It's really true. So, there's something interesting about when you take a long journey. Kevin and I were going to Boston recently. We had to fly out, I think to Albuquerque maybe, and we had to get a last minute Uber. And the guy showed up in a handicapped van. And we were like, wow. And it was really interesting. It was really cold, and he wanted to take back roads to the airport. Not our best ride in an Uber. And we realized when we got to the airport that the tires were also bald on the van that was going with all this equipment in it, in the cold van with, the back roads. And so what we learned about that is you really want to check the tires before you get started on a journey with a stranger, someone you don't know. And thank goodness that in marriage you're not complete strangers. But what can happen with tires is you can get into a lot of trouble, right? Like that's your ability to stay grounded, right? To actually know what it is you need and how to get that in a marriage. It's really about expectations, right? So if I'm going into a marriage expecting that Kevin is going to whatever, make me happy or do this or do that, like I might be very disappointed, right? If Kevin is looking for someone to just stay home and wash dishes and do all that, I was good with that for about 30 years. But it's funny, as you change and as you move on the journey, your expectations change, right? So it's very interesting to think about expectations and how they are what we need, and we don't even always know what that is. And yet it's this internal thing that we're sort of demanding of the world that maybe we don't express. It's really interesting about expectations.
Yeah, and I think that if we could stick with tires for just a minute, and that was a terrifying ride, but they have to be changed. And I think in life, we have to change things in our life. We keep the same, car. We probably keep the same engine, right? Not that we don't have to change a part here or there, but the tires regularly have to be changed. And I think what I found is that or it gets to be a pretty bumpy ride, or it becomes unsafe. And I think the same is true in marriage partnerships. So part of what the dashboard is designed here to do is stop and say, okay, what do we need to change? We've got a certain amount of mileage on these things, and this could be true in any vehicle, right? But there's certain parts that are wear parts, and in particular the tires, because you could have the most fantastic, expensive, $1 million vehicle, and if you got bald tires, it's unsafe. And you can have kind of a jalopy, but if you got great tires, you're probably safer than others. And so, what do we need to change in our lives? What's going to keep us grounded? And for us, we have to go back and maintain that. And there's a lot of ways we can go, but I think one of the ways that we stay grounded is do some things together, take some walks on a daily basis, do some hikes, you spend time in the car, when we're going on a journey, do it together instead of taking two cars. We need connect time to stay grounded to each other, if you will, and connected, because we are trying to be in this together, but we're still two independent people, and it's easy for us to wear at different paces. And so I just think about like what in our marriage needs to be updated or changed. What do we need to put away? And sometimes it's a very little removal. We're changing something. Other times it's much more subtle. But it is about staying grounded and connected.
It's so true. Like when I first started building my business, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, we had very traditional roles. I made dinner. Kevin, was running his business, and then all of a sudden, I was starting a business and creating a website and doing all of these different things. And I didn't have time to make dinner. I would get home at 5:30, and I'd be like, "Oh, that's right, dinner." And so you started picking up the cooking. Like that's a big shift for us, right?
Yeah, that was big.
I mean, in the beginning of the marriage, it was like, how do I make spaghetti again? The jar of sauce, and I boiled the noodles. Is that like I do that at the same time? That's a lot, right? But over these last 4 or 5 years, you've actually like probably a better cook than I am. But it's funny because that was a huge change. We changed something that was very routine for us. I just made meals and they were decent and I fed the family. But you have this creativity with cooking that I don't have. I do not ever buy smoked paprika or I don't know, whatever other thing you've been buying lately. But so it's so interesting because even the change brings a freshness and a newness that you didn't have before. So that idea of how do we travel together and what needs to be changed, that's huge because it's really about expectations. Kevin, for 30 years, expected me to make dinner and I expected me to make dinner. So then I expected me to make dinner while I was running a business and starting a business and I couldn't meet my own expectations. And you kind of had to let me off the hook and say, oh, well, I can make dinner. That's a huge shift in a marriage, I think.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of those shifts that happen as kids grow, as you have challenges, as, again, illness or parents or any number of things. But we have to kind of, what we could look at division of workload, right? But the fact is we need to eat. Right. And so, we have to kind of look at this joint problem. It's not your problem. Hey, it's this way. So I think household duties, I think who pays the bills, I think all those sorts of things might need to change. So the concept here is what in your marriage maybe needs to change to allow you to have a smoother ride going forward.
It's true. And it kind of leads us to the next point of the marriage dashboard is really this idea of collaboration or competition. Right. So there's this other gauge. I don't know what we want to call it, but it's a funny gauge of like, am I leaning hot or cold maybe? Right. And when things are working and humming, it's because you're collaborating. You're not competing with each other. Like if I try to compete with Kevin on LinkedIn connections, I'm going to lose my mind. Right. There is this feeling of like, oh, we're in similar arenas. There's this need to compete or whatever. Even with take the cooking, for instance. Right. Like I could get all worried about Kevin's great cooking, but I'm just thrilled by it. So there's this idea of encouraging one another, and that leads to a collaboration rather than criticizing leads to a competition, right? So you see how you're going to go hot or cold, and the minute you start drifting into competing, criticism, that leads to a very chilly ride. So just don't go there, right? Like really lean into this idea of how do I lift you up? How do I encourage you? What do you need my help with to make your life thrive and then our life together thrive? Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I might add the word comparison.
Yes.
I think you're better at some things than I am, and I'm better at some things than you are. And it's not good or bad, right or wrong. It's just what it is. I mean, based on physical, based on history, based on whatever, just giftedness, if we can use a word like that. And so I think that sometimes it's easy to look at the other and say they're better at that than I am. And I think I did that with cooking for you're a better cook than me. Well, I never really applied myself, right? Turns out I can actually do it. And I actually I enjoy it, right? So that's the funny thing. It's actually something I genuinely find pleasure in that I used to, but I never really had applied myself because that was your job. And I always thought you're better than me at that, so I can't do that. So that was my narrative, right? And so I think there can be competition, but there can also be kind of judgment, and that's the way it is. And I think, again, stepping back, taking a fresh look. So I think these comparisons can actually be judgments, and they can be very self-limiting. So I think you're better at me than this, and so I don't even try, or I get frustrated because maybe I don't like to do it. But again, it's the competition. And look, there's stuff we both just don't like. It just has to get done, right? Nobody wants to change a diaper when you have a baby. I mean, it's not fun, but it has to be done. So I think that we have to just figure that stuff out. But I think there's times, it's not conscious, but we're competitive and we're not collaborative, which is that word. We're really, for whatever reason, trying to one up the other. I don't even know how to do. I can't even tell you why it happens, but it happens. And we're best when we're collaborating and we're working together and we're kind of checking in with each other.
True. And I'm going to add another word, competition, in there. Like there's this idea, like you said, that we're one-upping one another. And it just made me think of competition, right? Like we don't want to be competing. We're on the same team, right? And that is just so hard to remember sometimes, because when you started cooking, like there was a space created. I didn't even mean to create that space for you, but all of a sudden we were collaborating. You all of a sudden found this joy in cooking that you didn't know you had, and it made our whole life more fun. And so I think when we stop competing, comparing, criticizing, all of that, it really makes a difference, because it changes the atmosphere really in our marriage. And I think that's a beautiful thing.
Well,
can
I
add one more thing?
Well, so again, I'll look at the audience for a minute, or say we're Diane and Kevin. We're very different. So be careful, because we can also compare other couples. And I think sometimes we have other friends and we'll be like, how come she does that over there and you don't? There's a lot of comparisons that go outside of marriage too, that we bring into the marriage. So I can be subconsciously comparing Diane to another person in another relationship if I'm not careful. So just that's a whole nother level. But I think this comparison is about expectation. And again, it's just staying connected throughout this process.
So true, so true. Well, there is one thing we want to tell you about that we can't help you with. So on the Inspired Marriage podcast, we're going to help you with little things, like tweaks, pay attention to this, think about this with communication, try this with, how you're relating to one another. But when it comes to the engine light going off, we cannot help you, right? So this is where maybe there's a huge betrayal in your marriage. Maybe there's infidelity. Maybe there's addiction. If there's something like that going on, you're literally the engine in front of your car is there's smoke pouring out. You probably need to stop. We know you do, and you need to seek professional help, because what this podcast is not is a fix-it answer solution. What this is a conversation with you. Like, we want you to have tools, right? So that's why we created the marriage dashboard, so you can check in and say, well, how is our communication? Have I been clear about my expectations? What am I thinking about how I'm communicating and what I'm doing, and how do we play together, and what are we doing to keep things growing and changing and shifting? So those are the important things. When you get to a major crisis, you want to go get professional help for sure.
Yeah. We've had a few times during our marriage when we've gone out and got counseling and had help and reached out, and it's been extraordinarily helpful. So I think situationally, we do the best we can, but there's times when, for any number of reasons, or even just generally, it's probably a good idea to seek professional help just to get a check-in. So we want to stay within our limits and our boundaries, and we get help, and we encourage you to do that. But what we want to do is be an encouragement. We want to stimulate conversation. We want to give you practical tools to use, and we want to create places where you can work on helping your marriage, helping your partnership to be one that doesn't just survive, but thrives.
It's true. And we're going to give you one tidbit that we got early on in our marriage, and that is, if you want to have the cheapest counseling ever, go on a date night every week. Doesn't matter if it's just the two of you, if you have 10 kids, right? When you get out of your own routine out of your house and you sit down and look at each other across from a table, it just changes the conversation. Kevin and I are, even though it's just the two of us at home now, we go out for a dinner or a drink and we have a better conversation. And that's what the Inspired Marriage podcast is all about, a better conversation. Someplace where you can actually think about a deeper question that's going to draw you closer together and give you just a better journey together. So,
and if you want to learn more about what we're about, click on the Inspired Marriage link, and there you can see additional resources and even an opportunity to sign up for one of our seminars and retreats.
Thanks for joining us.
Have a great day.